The leather chairs alone cost more than 6 months of rent. He knew this because he'd looked it up once, during a night when the cold kept him awake and his phone's dying battery gave him just enough time to scroll through furniture websites he'd never afford. Now those same chairs surrounded him in a semicircle, occupied by men and women whose watches could pay off his student debt 3 times over. The conference room stretched 40 feet in either direction, floor-to-ceiling windows framing a skyline that looked computer-generated in its perfection. Everything gleamed. The marble floors, the chrome fixtures, the teeth of every person staring at him like he tracked mud across a white carpet. His name was James, and he was 26 years old. His jacket had a coffee stain on the left cuff that he tried to hide by rolling the sleeve, but the attempt only made it more obvious. His shoes were the kind you bought at discount stores, leather-like material that creaked when he walked. He'd taken 3 buses to get here, standing the entire final leg because seats cost dignity on crowded transit, and the trip had left a film of city grime on his skin that no amount of hand-washing in the lobby bathroom could fully erase. The piano waited in the corner, a Steinway grand, black lacquer so deep it reflected the room like dark water. He'd seen one this beautiful exactly twice before. Once in a concert hall where he'd volunteered as an usher just to hear the performance. Once in a professor's home, during the single semester he'd managed at music school before the money ran out and his mother got sick. That was 4 years ago. 4 years of playing on street corners with a keyboard missing 3 keys. 4 years of winter fingers too numb to find the right notes. Summer heat warping the cheap plastic casing. 4 years of tourists dropping singles into his case while talking over his playing, treating him like ambient noise, like decoration, like something less than human. He was here because of a letter, handwritten, delivered to the corner where he played every Thursday outside the financial district. The stationery had weight to it, the kind that felt expensive just a touch. It invited him to perform at a private gathering. It promised compensation. It didn't mention that the gathering would be the quarterly board meeting of Thornton Capital Management, one of the largest private equity firms in the country. It didn't mention that compensation meant exposure, not payment. It definitely didn't mention Richard Thornton. Richard Thornton entered the way men like him always did, not through a door but through a parting of lesser beings. 6'3", silver hairstyle with the casual precision of someone who paid more for haircuts than James spent on food in a month. His suit was charcoal gray, custom-tailored to emphasize shoulders that still carried the memory of college athletics. He wore success like cologne, invisible but unmistakable, the kind of presence that made everyone else in the room sit up straighter without realizing they were doing it. "You're the piano player." Not a question. Richard's voice carried the particular confidence of someone who'd never been told no in any context that mattered. "The one from 5th and Market." James nodded. His throat felt lined with sandpaper. "My assistant saw you last month. Said you were decent." Richard circled the piano, running one finger along its edge. "We're having a small gathering after this meeting. Potential investors. Thought we'd give them some culture with their cocktails. You'll play for 90 minutes. Background music. Nothing too intense. My assistant will arrange payment." "Actually, sir," James's voice cracked. He cleared it, started again. "I was hoping we could discuss the rate before I commit. The letter didn't specify. The exposure alone is worth more than whatever you charge." Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You play on street corners. This is a room full of people who could change your life with a phone call. I'd call that fair compensation." 3 people laughed. Soft, polite chuckles that somehow felt louder than shouting. James felt heat climb his neck. His mother's words echoed in his skull. Asterisk, "Never let them see you small." Asterisk, she'd said that 2 weeks before she died, hand shaking from the medication, voice barely above a whisper. Asterisk, "You're worth something. Make them see it." Asterisk. Before we proceed, something feels important to share. This story reaches across cities, across circumstances, across every invisible line that separates one life from another. Maybe you're watching from a place where Richard's boardroom feels familiar. Maybe you're closer to James's corner, to the cold and the counting and the constant fear of not being enough. Wherever you are, New York penthouse or Nebraska bedroom, California campus or Texas truck stop, comment below and let the world know. These stories belong to all of us. They matter because you're here, because you're listening, because somewhere in this collision of privilege and pride, there's a mirror we all need to look into. So before another word unfolds, tell us where you're watching from. James took a breath that hurt his chest. I appreciate the opportunity, sir, but I need to eat next week. Exposure doesn't pay rent. The room went silent. Someone's phone buzzed against the table, absurdly loud. Richard's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. You're turning down a chance to play for the kind of people who fund symphonies, the kind who endow music schools. He walked closer, stopping just inside James's personal space. Let me guess. Juilliard dropout. Berkeley. Scholarship covered most of it until... James stopped. Explaining felt like bleeding in front of sharks. Until it didn't. Richard finished. Let me tell you something about the real world, street musician. Talent is common. Opportunity is rare. An opportunity doesn't negotiate. He turned to address the room. This is what happens when we coddle people. Give them just enough education to think they deserve more than they've earned. Back to James. You play. You take what I offer. Or you walk out that door and go back to begging for change from people too polite to tell you to stop. Jamesy's hands curled into fists. For years of swallowing insults, of smiling through dismissal, of being invisible unless someone needed something to ignore. 4 years compressed into this single moment. This choice between dignity and desperation. I have a proposal. The words left his mouth before his brain approved them. You mentioned potential investors. People who appreciate culture. He gestured toward the piano. Let me play something now. One piece. Your choice. If you think it's worth having at your gathering, we discuss fair payment. If not, I leave. No argument. Richard laughed, genuine surprise in the sound. You want to audition? Hey, now. I want to show you what you're actually getting. Jamesy's heart hammered against his ribs. Instead of just assuming. The room held its breath. Somewhere 17 floors below, traffic hummed. A siren wailed past. The ordinary world continued while this moment crystallized into something fragile and sharp. Richard's smile changed quality, gaining an edge like broken glass. All right, let's make it interesting. He walked to his briefcase, withdrew a folder, flipped through pages. Beethoven, Piano Sonata No. 29. Hammerklavier. First movement. He held up the sheet music. You know it. Jamesy's stomach dropped. The Hammerklavier. 4 to 5 minutes of the most technically demanding solo piano literature ever written. Beethoven had composed it while going deaf, pouring rage and grief into every measure. It required hands that could span tense effortlessly, stamina that could sustain 40 minutes of continuous complexity, and interpretive depth that took most pianists decades to develop. It was the piece professors assigned to humble, overconfident students. I know it. His voice barely functioned. Good. Richard's smile widened. Play the first movement. Just the first. If you can get through it, really play it, not just hit the notes. I'll pay you $10,000 for tonight's performance. Cash, plus another $90,000 if you finish without mistakes. He paused for effect. $100,000 total. For 15 minutes of music. Someone gasped. Another person whispered, "That's insane." But Richard raised one finger. When you fail, not if, when, you apologize to everyone in this room for wasting our time. You admit that you're exactly what you look like. A street performer who got lucky enough to learn a few party tricks but never had the discipline or talent for the real thing. You say it out loud, clearly, so we all hear. He crossed his arms. And then you leave. No payment. No second chances. Just the truth about who you really are. The air tasted metallic. Jamesy's hands trembled, fingers remembering cold mornings and broken keys and the endless repetition of scales in a one-bedroom apartment where his mother slept on the couch so he could have the bedroom with better acoustics. He thought about walking away. Thought about the buses back to his corner, to the cardboard sign that said music student, anything helps, to the slow erosion of dignity that came with every ignored performance. He thought about his mother's face the last time he played for her, how she'd closed her eyes and smiled like she could see the future he'd promised her, the stages and the applause and the life where music meant more than survival. Okay. The word came out steady. I accept. Richard blinked. Just once. Fast. Surprise flickering across his features before the mask returned. You're serious. Completely. James walked toward the piano, each step feeling like crossing a border he couldn't uncross. His hands found the keys, cool and smooth. Muscle memory stirred, deeper than thought. The room receded to peripheral blare. He looked at Richard once more. One question before I start. What happens if I succeed? Richard's smile turned cold. You won't. James's fingers hovered above the keys, not quite touching, suspended in the half-second before transformation. The Steinway waited beneath his hands like a living thing, responsive and ready, so different from the equipment he'd learned to coax sound from these past 4 years. This instrument would forgive nothing. Every hesitation, every uncertainty would ring out across 40 feet of polished marble and leather chairs, amplified by acoustics designed to showcase rather than hide. The first chord struck like lightning. B-flat major, fortissimo, the full power of Beethoven's Declaration condensed into a single explosive moment. The sound filled the space, ricocheted off glass windows, made 3 people flinch. James didn't hesitate, didn't ease in gently. The hammerklavier demanded commitment from the first note, required the pianist to announce themselves with certainty or fail immediately. His right hand began the ascending figure, rapid 16th notes climbing 3 octaves while his left maintained the rhythmic pulse. The tempo marking read allegro, fast, but the real challenge wasn't speed. It was sustaining that speed across dense harmonic progressions, across hand-crossing passages that required split-second precision, across dynamic contrast that needed his touch to shift from thunderous to whisper-soft within the same measure. Richard stood frozen by his chair. His expression had shifted from smug anticipation to something more complicated. Attention, perhaps, or confusion. The kind of reaction that comes when expectation and reality diverge sharply enough to create cognitive dissonance. The development section approached, where Beethoven abandoned conventional structure and plunged into harmonic territory that even modern listeners found challenging. James's hands moved in patterns drilled so deep they bypassed conscious thought. Thousands of hours compressed into this moment. Every scale his mother had made in practice, every theory lesson he'd absorbed during that 2-short year at Berkeley, every performance he'd studied on library computers because he couldn't afford recordings. His fingers remembered what his mind might forget. They knew the weight required for each key, the exact angle to strike for the sound he needed, the way to coax singing tone from harmonic brilliance. A woman in the front row leaned forward, elbows on knees, watching his hands like they held answers to questions she hadn't known to ask. Another board member had stopped checking his phone entirely, device dark on the table in front of him. The room's energy had shifted, no longer the polite tolerance of background entertainment, but the focused silence of people witnessing something unexpected. The music built toward the first climax, a cascade of octaves in both hands that required perfect synchronization and the physical stamina of an athlete. James felt sweat gathering at his temples, felt the burn beginning in his forearms. The hammerklavier wasn't called hammer keyboard for nothing. Beethoven had written it for the new, more robust pianos of his era, instruments that could withstand the force he demanded. Playing it felt like controlled violence, like channeling rage through precision. A memory surfaced unbidden. His mother's hands, swollen from double shifts at the hospital laundry, still finding the strength to massage his cramping fingers after marathon practice sessions. Asterisk, you have a gift, asterisk, she'd said. Asterisk, don't ever be ashamed of it. Don't ever make yourself smaller so other people feel comfortable. Asterisk, she'd worked herself to death so he could have music lessons. Had refused treatment for her cancer for 3 months because the copers would have meant stopping his tuition payments. He'd only found out after she died, after reading through medical bills and insurance denials and appointment records that showed her choosing him over herself again and again, until there was nothing left to choose. The exposition repeated, standard sonata form, but Beethoven made nothing standard. James's interpretation revealed training that street performance could never showcase. He shaped phrases with mathematical precision, highlighting the structural elements that made this music architectural rather than merely melodic. Every voice in the complex counterpoint emerged distinctly. Every harmonic tension resolved with satisfying clarity. This wasn't party music. This was music that demanded intellectual engagement, that required listeners to work as hard as the performer. An older man in the back, silver beard, expensive glasses, stood up and moved closer, navigating around chairs to reach a position where he could see James's hands directly. His face showed recognition, the look of someone who understood the technical difficulty being overcome in real time. Richard's jaw had tightened. His arms remained crossed, but the posture had changed from superiority to something more defensive. He'd made a bet assuming failure, counting on humiliation to underscore his point about merit and worth. Instead, the room was filling with a truth he hadn't anticipated. The street musician could play. Really play. The development section deepened, modulating through distant key areas that Beethoven used to create a sense of being lost in harmonic wilderness. James followed the map perfectly, his fingers finding paths through musical territory that required absolute certainty. One wrong note here would compound, would make the next passage impossible, would create a cascade of failure. But he didn't hesitate. His muscle memory held the entire movement, not as isolated measures but as a continuous narrative arc. He knew where he'd been, where he was going, how each phrase connected to build toward the inevitable climax. The woman who'd leaned forward earlier turned to Richard. "Where did you find him?" Her voice carried genuine wonder. Richard didn't answer. His face had gone carefully neutral, the expression of someone recalculating odds mid-game. The recapitulation began, the return of the opening material, transformed by everything that had come between. James played it with the authority of someone who understood the journey, who could show the listener how the music had changed even as it repeated. His hands executed a particularly treacherous passage, chromatic runs in contrary motion, the kind of figure that existed primarily to prove a pianist's technical mastery, and made it sound not just accurate but inevitable, like this was the only possible sequence of notes in the universe. Someone started clapping, then stopped abruptly, remembering that the performance wasn't finished. The bearded man who'd moved closer spoke quietly to the woman beside him. "That's conservatory training. Maybe higher. That's not self-taught technique." The final push toward the coda began, Beethoven driving the music toward exhaustion, demanding everything the performer could give. James's shoulders ached. His forearms screamed. Sweat dripped down his spine, darkening his shirt. But his hands never faltered. They maintained the relentless tempo, the massive sound, the technical precision that the hammerklavier required as the price of entry. The last page approached. The coda built to its final climax. Massive chords in both hands, the full range of the keyboard, dynamics that pushed the instrument to its physical limits. James played like he was trying to break something, like he was channeling every frustration and disappointment and moment of being invisible into this final statement of existence. The final chord rang out, B-flat major again, fortissimo, resolving the journey with absolute certainty. He held the sustained pedal down, letting the sound decay naturally, letting the room absorb the reverberations until silence felt like part of the music. For 5 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then the bearded man began clapping. Slow, deliberate applause that acknowledged more than entertainment. Others joined, tentative at first, then building, until the entire room was standing, until the ovation filled the space with sound almost as powerful as the music itself. Richard stood alone, arms still crossed, face carefully blank. But his eyes told a different story. They held the expression of someone who'd just lost a bet they believed was unlosable, who'd miscalculated badly enough to reveal something about themselves they prefer stayed hidden. James stood, turned from the piano, and met Richard's gaze across the room. He didn't smile, didn't gloat, just waited. "Well," Richard's voice cut through the applause. The room quieted. "I suppose congratulations are in order. You can play." A pause. "The question is, how?" James felt the shift, the moment transforming from technical achievement to personal interrogation. "I had training." Before he stopped. Explaining still felt like bleeding. Before what? The bearded man stepped closer. Before you ended up on a street corner? Because that wasn't amateur playing, son. That was professional-grade interpretation. Conservatory level, minimum. He turned to Richard. Where did you find him? Fifth and Market. Richard's tone held edges of something sharp. Playing for tourists. The room's energy changed again. Confusion mixed with curiosity. How did someone with that level of training end up begging for change on a sidewalk? Before anyone can move forward with assumptions, before this story reveals its deeper layers, something needs to happen here. Right now, in this moment of recognition and confusion, take a second to act. Hit the like button if this story's grabbed you by the throat. Drop a comment with your thoughts. Are you surprised? Skeptical? Rooting for James or waiting for the other shoe to drop? Share this with someone who needs to see that worth isn't always visible from the surface. Subscribe, because this is only Chapter 2 and you'll want to know how this resolves. And scroll down to the description box below for more stories that challenge what we think we know about people, about value, about the invisible lines we draw between deserving and disposable. James stood under their collective gaze, feeling exposed in a different way than he'd felt on street corners. At least there, anonymity was built in. Visibility demanded explanation. The woman in the front row spoke gently. What happened? Why aren't you performing professionally? James looked at his hands, calloused from cold metal keys, scarred from the one time someone tried to steal his equipment and he'd fought back, still trembling slightly from the physical demand of the hammerclavier. These hands had held his mother's during her final breaths, had closed her eyes, had played at her funeral in an empty chapel because they couldn't afford anything else. My mother got sick. The words came out flat, drained of feeling. I was finishing my first year at Berkeley. Full scholarship. They'd wanted me in their performance program since I was 16. But she had cancer. No insurance. The treatment options in network weren't working. There were trials, experimental therapies, but they weren't covered. He swallowed. I had to choose between school and keeping her alive. Silence wrapped the room like fabric. I chose her. Left Berkeley, moved back home, worked 3 jobs to cover what the trials cost. She made it 2 more years. Died anyway. His voice stayed level, each word measured. By then, my scholarship was gone. My spot in the program was filled, and I had $30,000 in medical debt that collectors call about twice a week. The bearded man's expression shifted to something like pain. Son, there are programs. Financial aid, hardship exceptions. I tried. James cut him off gently. Spent 6 months applying for readmission, 4 loans, 4 grants. Berkeley said my academic gap was too long without a clear return timeline. Other schools said my incomplete year counted against me. Banks said my debt-to-income ratio made me unqualified for student loans. He shrugged, so I did what I could. Found the corner with the best acoustics and the most foot traffic. Bought a used keyboard. Started playing. 4 years ago. Richard's voice had changed temperature, lost some of its earlier coldness. You've been on that corner for 4 years. 3 years and 8 months. James corrected. But who's counting? The woman in the front row pulled out her phone, fingers moving rapidly across the screen. She held it up, showing a photo. James on his corner, cardboard sign beside him, winter coat 3 sizes too big. This you? He nodded. She swiped to another photo. A crowd gathered around him, people filming on their phones, a teenager in the front row crying. This went semi-viral last Christmas. You played Silent Night for 90 minutes while it snowed. Someone in the comments said you played it differently every time, like you were improvising variations. She looked up. That was you. Needed to keep my hands warm. Repetition with variation, it's basic technique. He said it simply, without ego. The bearded man laughed. Short, sharp, amazed. Basic. He calls Beethoven basic. To Richard, do you have any idea what you almost threw away? Richard's face had gone carefully still. The bet was $100,000 if he finished without mistakes. He straightened. You finished. No mistakes. The words came out grudging. I honor my agreements. The checkbook appeared from Richard's briefcase with a weight of inevitability, leather-bound, embossed with initials, the kind of object that announced wealth before a single number was written. Richard placed it on the piano's edge, uncapped a fountain pen that probably cost more than James's monthly expenses, and paused. Before I write this, his voice carried a new quality, something almost approaching respect. I need to know, how did you learn the hammerklavier? That's not street corner repertoire. That's not even standard conservatory repertoire until graduate level. James's fingers traced the piano's edge, still feeling the ghost of the keys beneath them. My mother's father was a pianist. Trained in Moscow, defected in the 70s, taught at a small college in Oregon until he died when I was 8. The words came easier now, as if the performance had opened something. He left his music library to my mother. She couldn't play, never had the patience for it, but she saved every score, every recording. When I was 5 and she realized I could hear pitch perfectly, she used his books to teach me. We couldn't afford lessons, so she learned music theory from library books and taught me everything she understood. The woman in the front row had tears tracking mascara down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. The hammerklavier was his favorite piece. He performed it once, at his final recital before the defection. My mother had a recording, terrible quality, tape degraded, but you could hear how he played it, like it was the last music that would ever exist. James looked up. She made me promise I'd learn it. Said it was the piece that proved whether someone was a pianist or just someone who played piano. A breath. Took me 3 years to get through the first movement. Took another 2 before I could play it without mistakes. I finished it 2 months before she got her diagnosis. Richard's hand moved across the check, writing numbers with careful precision. He tore it free, held it up, $100,000, made out to James Riley. The amount looked impossible, written in ink that wouldn't erase. But he didn't hand it over. Not yet. There's something else. Richard walked to his briefcase again, withdrew a second folder. This one was old, manila yellowed with age, edges worn soft. He held it like it contained something fragile. You said your grandfather defected in the 70s. Moscow training. Performed the hammerklavier. His fingers tapped the folder. What was his name? James felt something cold settle in his stomach. Dmitry Volkov. Why? The room's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Richard opened the folder. Inside were newspaper clippings, programs from concerts decades old, photographs in black and white. He held up one photo, a young man at a piano, intense focus on his face, hands caught mid-performance. The resemblance hit like a fist. The same long fingers, the same sharp cheekbones, the same expression James had seen in mirrors after difficult performances. Your grandfather, Richard's voice had gone strange, hollow. Dmitry Volkov. He died in 1989. Car accident outside Portland. You were 8. Yes. James didn't understand where this was going, but dread was building like thunderheads. My father, Richard set the folder down, hands unsteady now. My father was Thomas Thornton. In 1977, he was a graduate student at Princeton, International Relations, Soviet Studies. He traveled to Moscow as part of a research delegation. Your grandfather was performing at a state function. They met afterward. The bearded man had gone very still. Others in the room leaned forward, sensing the shape of something they couldn't quite see. Your grandfather asked my father for help. Richard's voice dropped to something almost inaudible. He wanted to defect. Had a wife, a daughter, your mother, who was 2 years old. The authorities were watching him because of his Western contacts. He was afraid if he tried to leave through official channels, his family would be punished. Richard looked directly at James. My father helped him, arranged the defection, got him and his family out through Helsinki, provided the initial sponsorship when they arrived in the U.S., set up his teaching position in Oregon. James's world tilted. That's impossible. My mother never mentioned. Your grandfather made him promise not to tell. Richard pulled another document from the folder, a letter, written in Cyrillic with an English translation paperclipped behind. This is from Dmitry to my father, written 3 weeks before the defection. It says, he read aloud, voice catching. I cannot repay what you risk for me. All I have is music and love for my family. If something happens to me, if the state catches us, please do not let them forget me. Please help my daughter understand that I chose freedom so she could choose her own life." The woman in the front row made a sound like a wounded animal. My father kept this folder for 48 years. Richard's composure was cracking, edges showing through. He died last year. Heart attack. His will included instructions. If any member of Dmitry Volkov's family ever crossed my path, I was to help them. However I could. Whatever they needed. He laughed, sharp and bitter. And here you are, Dmitry's grandson, playing the hammerklavier in my boardroom because I wanted to humiliate you for sport. The silence felt like suffocation. James took the folder with shaking hands. Inside were more photos. His grandfather and Richard's father standing together outside a concert hall. Both young men, both smiling with the particular joy of people who'd accomplished something impossible together. Programs from his grandfather's American performances, reviews that praised his interpretation of Beethoven, a photo of his grandmother holding his mother as an infant, face bright with hope in a new country. At the bottom of the folder, a business card. Thomas Thornton's card, with a phone number written on the back in faded ink. Beside it, a note in English, for Dimitri's family, if ever needed. He tried to find you. Richard's voice broke. After your grandfather died, my father tried to locate your grandmother, your mother. But they'd moved, changed names slightly, Americanized them. He searched for years, left the instructions in his will because he never stopped hoping. James couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The weight of history pressed down like atmosphere. Decades of connection compressed into this single moment. His mother had never mentioned this, had never spoken about how they escaped, about who helped, about the debt that remained unpaid for 2 generations. The bearded man spoke quietly. Thomas Thornton was a good man, one of the finest I knew. He funded dozens of scholarships, helped hundreds of refugees, never took credit, never expected recognition. He looked at James with something like reverence. He would have been proud to know Dimitri's grandson inherited his talent. Richard held out the check again. This time, when James took it, Richard didn't let go immediately. "This isn't payment for the performance." His voice was raw. "This is a down payment on a debt my father owed. The full debt." He pulled out his phone, made a call. "Cancel my 3 o'clock, and bring the scholarship fund documents to the boardroom." He hung up. "The full debt is going to take more than money." James looked at the check, at the folder, at the room full of strangers who'd become witnesses to something none of them expected. The number on the check could clear his medical debt entirely, could give him breathing room, could buy time to figure out what came next. But Richard's expression suggested something bigger was unfolding. "My father established a foundation." Richard spoke quickly now, words tumbling out like he'd been holding them too long. "The Thornton Arts Endowment. It funds scholarships for musicians from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. Full tuition, living expenses, instrument funding, everything. 50 students nationwide." He pulled out a chair, sat heavily. "I've been managing it since his death. Badly. I let the board talk me into prioritizing measurable outcomes over raw talent. We started requiring minimum GPAs, uninterrupted academic records, financial need calculations that excluded anyone with debt because we viewed it as poor planning." The woman in the front row closed her eyes. "Oh, Richard. We turned away hundreds of applicants who needed it most because they didn't fit the formula." Richard looked at James. "Applicants exactly like you. People who chose family over career. People who had gaps in their education for reasons that revealed character, not lack of commitment." He stood, paced to the window, stared out at the city below. "My father would have been horrified." The bearded man nodded slowly. "Thomas built that foundation specifically to help people the traditional system excluded. You know that." "I know." Richard turned back. "And I'm going to fix it. Starting now." To James, "I'm offering you a full scholarship to any music program in the country that will accept you. Tuition, housing, living expenses, medical coverage. Everything. For as long as it takes to complete your degree." James's hands went numb. The check fluttered to the floor. Someone picked it up, handed it back. I can't." "You can." Richard's voice held absolute certainty. And more than that, I'm restructuring the entire endowment. New criteria, talent and need, period. No GPA requirements for applicants with documented hardship. No penalization for academic gaps caused by family illness, financial crisis, or other circumstances beyond control. Active recruitment from non-traditional venues. He smiled, sharp and determined. Street corners, community centers, church basements, anywhere someone might be making music without institutional support. The room erupted. Board members talking over each other, questions flying, the woman in the front row openly crying now. Through it all, Richard stood steady, having made a decision that felt less like philanthropy and more like penance. James sat at the piano bench, folder in his lap, check in his hand, unable to process the scope of what was happening. 1 hour ago, he'd been invisible, dismissible, a street performer presumed to lack talent, discipline, worth. Now he held documentary proof that his family's history was entwined with a man who'd tried to humiliate him, that the debt he believed belonged only to him was actually part of a larger story, one that stretched across decades and continents and the invisible threads that connect strangers into something approaching family. Richard knelt beside the piano bench, eye level with James. I'm sorry. For the bet, for the cruelty, for every assumption I made about who you are based on where I found you. His voice dropped lower. My father spent his life trying to pay forward what he considered a debt, the honor of helping your grandfather escape. He would have wanted me to help you. Instead, I almost destroyed you for entertainment. He extended his hand. Let me fix this. Please. James looked at the hand, at the check, at the folder of history he'd never known existed. His mother's face floated through memory, her smile when he played, her pride when he got accepted to Berkeley, her guilt when he left to care for her. She'd never told him about Dimitri's escape, about Thomas Thornton's help, about the foundation that existed specifically to assist families like theirs. Why? Understanding arrived like dawn. She hadn't wanted him to feel obligated, hadn't wanted him to believe he owed anyone anything. She'd wanted him to succeed or fail on his own merit, to never question whether opportunity came from talent or historical debt. But that choice had cost him everything, had left him alone, struggling, invisible. James took Richard's hand. The handshake felt like signing something permanent, like crossing a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. I accept, on one condition. Richard waited. Every student in that program learns about your father and my grandfather, about what it means to help someone across borders, across circumstances, across the lines we draw between deserving and disposable. Jamesy's voice strengthened, and every scholarship recipient commits to passing it forward, however they can, wherever they end up. The debt doesn't end, it multiplies. Richard's smile transformed his face. Deal. If you're still watching, if you made it this far into Jamesy's journey from invisible to invaluable, now's the moment to act. Like this video if the twists have earned it. Comment below with what you think happens next, or what this story makes you feel, or who in your life plays beautiful music that nobody bothers to hear. Share it with someone who needs to know that worth doesn't expire just because circumstances change. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that challenge what we think we know about people. And check the description box below for similar narratives about the moments that split one life from another, about the kindness that echoes across generations, about the music that saves us when nothing else can. The board meeting resumed, not with business, but with planning. The woman in the front row, introduced now as Patricia Chen, director of the foundation, pulled out her laptop and started drafting new criteria. The bearded man, Professor Erickson, Juilliard faculty on the advisory board, made phone calls to colleagues at conservatories nationwide. Others contributed ideas, contacts, resources. The energy in the room had transformed from corporate efficiency to something more urgent, more human. Richard stood at the head of the table, orchestrating the transformation with the same intensity he'd brought to business. We announced the changes publicly. Full press release. I want every musician who gave up because the system failed them to know there's a path back. I want every kid playing in subway stations to understand they are not invisible. James sat at the piano, hands resting on the keys, barely believing this was real. The check in his pocket felt like more than money. It felt like permission to imagine futures he'd stopped letting himself want. 6 weeks passed like a dream with weight. The press release hit every major outlet, traditional media, social media, music industry publications. Thornton Foundation revolutionizes music scholarships ran in the Times. Street musician inspires philanthropic overhaul in the Post. But it was the social media response that truly changed things. Videos of street performers, garage bands, church choir singers flooding Twitter and TikTok with the hashtag #ThorntonChallenge, each one showing talent that had nowhere to go until the door opened. James moved into a small apartment in Manhattan. 1 bedroom, functional kitchen, windows that let in actual sunlight. The contrast with his previous situation felt stark every morning when he woke up without cold seeping through inadequate walls, without the anxiety of counting dollars against days until rent came due. The medical debt disappeared, paid in full by Richard personally, separate from the scholarship fund. "That's not foundation money," Richard had said when James tried to refuse. "That's my money. I'm paying for my own arrogance." Barkley had responded within a week. Full readmission to the performance program, credits from his first year fully reinstated, personal letter from the department chair expressing regret for the bureaucratic failures that had excluded him. Julie had sent an offer to, and Curtis, in the New England Conservatory. James had options for the first time in 4 years. He chose Barkley, partly for practical reasons. They already knew him, had history together, offered the clearest path to completion. But mostly because his mother was buried 90 minutes away, and he wasn't ready to put more distance between himself and the woman who'd made all of this possible in ways he was only beginning to understand. Richard's transformation had been equally dramatic. The board meeting incident had forced him to confront the gap between his father's values and his own behavior, between inherited responsibility and earned integrity. He restructured not just the foundation, but his entire approach to wealth and power. The quarterly investor meetings now included performances by foundation recipients. The corporate art budget shifted from buying prestige pieces to commissioning work from emerging artists. He personally reviewed every scholarship application, read every essay, watched every audition video. "I'm trying to see people the way my father did," he told James during one of their weekly check-ins, a routine that had emerged organically as their relationship evolved from antagonist to something more complex. "Before I decided who they were based on where they were standing when I met them." The foundation itself exploded. Applications increased 14-fold in the first month. Donations poured in from unexpected sources. Musicians who'd struggled before finding success, educators who'd watched talented students disappear into economic necessity, ordinary people moved by the story of a debt repaid across 2 generations. The original 50 scholarships expanded to 200, then 300. Patricia Chen hired a full staff, established regional audition centers, created mentorship programs pairing recipients with established professionals. But the real transformation was harder to measure, harder to quantify in press releases and donor reports. It lived in the emails James received daily. Stories from musicians who'd given up, who'd believed talent without privilege meant nothing, who'd found the courage to try again because someone had proven the system could change. It lived in the videos of his Hammerklavier performance that had gone viral, 17 million views and counting. Comments full of people saying, "I didn't know music could sound like that, and this made me remember why I started playing, and I've been working on this piece for 3 years, and now I understand what I've been missing." James returned to his corner once, 3 weeks after the Boardroom incident. Not to play for change, but to see the space differently. Someone else had claimed it, a young woman with a violin, playing Vivaldi with technical competence but no particular passion. She saw him watching, recognized him from the viral videos, nearly dropped her bow in surprise. "This is your spot," she said, already packing up. "I didn't mean to. It's not mine anymore." James stopped her. "Keep it, but can I give you some advice?" She nodded, eyes wide. "Play something you love, not something you think tourists want to hear. Play the piece that makes you forget you're cold or hungry or invisible. Play like the music matters more than the money." He pulled out a business card, Thornton Foundation, Patricia Chen's direct number. And when you're ready to do more than survive, call this number. Tell them James sent you. The following week, the woman emailed. She'd called, had an audition scheduled, wanted to thank him. James forwarded the email to Richard with a simple note, "It's working." Richard's response came immediately, "We're just getting started." Berkeley's fall semester began with James sitting in familiar classrooms, surrounded by students 5 years younger who'd followed traditional paths. At first, the age gap created distance. They were fresh from high school, unburdened by loss or debt or years of invisibility. He felt ancient in comparison, carved out by experience they couldn't imagine. But gradually, connections formed. They asked about the Boardroom video, about learning the hammer clavier on street corners, about maintaining technical precision without consistent access to quality instruments. He answered honestly, without self-pity or false modesty, and discovered that vulnerability created bridges. His performance techniques had evolved during those street corner years in ways conservatory training couldn't replicate. He'd learned to project sound across traffic noise, to read crowds and adjust repertoire instantly, to maintain focus despite distractions. Those skills translated into unusual strengths in the conservatory setting. He could perform in any conditions, could adapt to unexpected problems mid-performance, could connect with audiences who'd never attended classical concerts because he understood what it meant to meet people where they were. By mid-semester, he was mentoring younger students. The department chair, recognizing his unique perspective, asked him to speak at the prospective student open house. James agreed but insisted on one condition. Half the attendees had to be recruited from non-traditional venues. Street corners, community centers, youth detention facilities, anywhere music happened outside institutional structures. The open house drew 300 people. James performed a movement from the hammer clavier, then spoke for 20 minutes about talent and privilege, about his mother and his grandfather, about the difference between playing music and needing music like oxygen. Afterward, 4 to 7 people submitted applications to Berkeley who'd never considered it accessible before. Richard attended, sitting in the back row, watching his father's legacy multiply through James's willingness to transform personal pain into communal possibility. When it ended, he approached James with an envelope. "What's this?" James asked. "Open it." Inside, a letter from the Thornton Foundation Board. They'd established a new position, Director of Outreach and Non-Traditional Student Programs. They wanted James. Full salary, flexible schedule to accommodate his studies, mandate to reimagine how the foundation identified and recruited talent. James looked up, speechless. "You've proven something in 6 weeks that I spent years failing to understand," Richard said. "You've shown that invisible doesn't mean worthless. That street corners produce virtuosos. That the traditional system misses most of the talent it claims to develop." He gestured to the departing crowd, diverse in age and appearance, unified in their hunger for opportunity. "My father wanted to build bridges. You're better at it than I ever was." James thought about his mother, about the job she'd worked so he could have lessons, about the way she'd died still believing his music mattered. He thought about his grandfather, about the courage it took to flee everything familiar for the possibility of freedom. He thought about Thomas Thornton, about a debt repaid with compound interest across 2 generations. "I accept," he said, "but I have conditions." Richard smiled. "Of course you do. Every student we recruit gets paired with a mentor from their community. Someone who knows what it's like to be invisible, who remembers the weight of choosing between music and survival. We don't extract talent from difficult circumstances. We build ecosystems that support talent wherever it emerges." Done. And we establish a fund specifically for medical emergencies, so no one else has to choose between a parent's life and their own education. James's voice caught. "Call it the Dmitry and Maria Volkov Fund. After my grandparents." Richard extended his hand. "Done. Anything else?" James thought about the woman on his old corner, about the thousands of musicians playing right now in subway stations and shopping districts and parks, invisible to everyone except the few who stop to really listen. "We make a documentary about this whole story, about how we met, about my grandfather and your father, about the foundation's transformation. We distribute it free to schools everywhere. So kids growing up in poverty see proof that worth isn't determined by circumstance. I'll fund it personally, Richard said. And I'll sit for whatever interviews humiliate me, because people need to see what I got wrong and how you forced me to confront it. The handshake lasted longer this time, cemented something that went beyond transaction or even friendship. It was covenant, shared purpose, recognition that some debts multiply rather than diminish when you try to repay them. 6 months after the Boardroom incident, the documentary premiered. The Hammerklavier debt, music, migration, and generational justice ran on PBS, streamed on 3 platforms, was translated into 14 languages. It showed James on his corner in winter, fingers red with cold, playing Chopin for tourists who never looked up. It showed the Boardroom confrontation. Richard had insisted on including security footage, wanted his cruelty documented as warning. It showed his grandfather's defection, animated from archival footage in Thomas Thornton's journals. It showed the foundation's transformation, interviewed students whose lives had changed because someone decided to measure worth differently. The response overwhelmed every projection. Music schools across the country adopted the Thornton model. The conservatory application process nationwide shifted toward holistic review, valued life experience alongside traditional metrics. Most importantly, street musicians, community performers, and self-taught prodigies saw themselves represented in institutional spaces that had previously excluded them by design. James received a letter from a 15-year-old in Detroit who'd taught himself piano in a church basement, who'd believed college was impossible until he'd watched someone who looked like his own father's journey transform into triumph. The kid had recorded his Juilliard audition on a phone, played Chopin with raw passion and imperfect technique, and been accepted with full support because someone finally understood that perfection and potential weren't the same thing. Richard framed that letter, hung it in his office beside a photo of his father and Dmitry Volkov. This is the measurement that matters, he told his board during the year-end review. Not return on investment. Not prestige rankings. This, a kid in Detroit who has a future because we decided to notice him. The foundation's first graduating class approached. 23 students who'd been accepted under the new criteria, who'd completed programs they'd never imagined accessing. James attended every recital, every thesis defense, every graduation. He watched them walk across stages in caps and gowns, watched their families weep with pride, watched them carry forward the lesson that transformation was possible even when systems insisted otherwise. At the final graduation ceremony, Richard gave a speech. He talked about his father's vision, about James's courage, about the difference between inherited values and embodied ones. He ended with a challenge. Each of you received something you'd been told was impossible. Not because you became who the system wanted, but because someone finally recognized who you already were. Pass it forward. Find the invisible people making beautiful things in places no one's looking. See them. Help them. Transform the next system that insists only certain kinds of people deserve access to their own potential. The graduates rose in standing ovation, not for Richard, but for the idea itself, that worth could be recognized rather than bestowed, that systems could bend toward justice when enough people decided to make them. James stood beside Richard, watching futures unfold in real time. The debt his grandfather had created through courage, that Thomas Thornton had answered through generosity, that his mother had carried forward through sacrifice, it hadn't been repaid. It had been multiplied, invested, transformed into something larger than any individual transaction. That night, James returned to his apartment, sat at the piano he now owned, not a Steinway, but a respectable upright that held tune and responded to nuance, and played the Hammerklavier in full. All 4 movements, 4 to 5 minutes of Beethoven's rage and grief and ultimate transcendence. He played it for his mother, for his grandfather, for Thomas Thornton, for Richard's transformation, for every student who'd received a chance they'd been told didn't exist. He played it because music was the only language sufficient for gratitude this profound, for change this comprehensive, for hope this hard-won and carefully preserved. Like, subscribe, share, comment below, and check the description box for more stories about the moments that redeem us. Now's the time to act if this journey's meant something to you. 18 months after the boardroom confrontation, James stood in the same space, same floor-to-ceiling windows framing the same impossible skyline. But everything else had changed. The quarterly board meeting had been redesigned. Half the attendees were foundation recipients, students and recent graduates invited to participate in governance, to shape the policies that would determine who came after them. The leather chairs remained expensive, but someone had added folding seats to accommodate the larger group, a physical reminder that exclusivity had given way to inclusion. Richard opened with the metrics everyone expected: applications up 218%, acceptance rate holding steady at competitive but achievable, retention rate among non-traditional students outperforming traditional admits by 6 percentage points. But he spent more time on the stories. The single mother in Arizona who'd returned to music after 15 years raising kids alone, now pursuing a master's in composition. The veteran in Georgia using piano performance as therapy, now teaching other veterans and applying for doctoral programs. The formerly incarcerated musician in California who'd learned jazz in a prison program, now performing professionally and mentoring at-risk youth. These aren't feel-good anecdotes, Richard said, voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned the hard way. These are data points proving that talent distribution doesn't correlate with access distribution. We've barely scratched the surface of human potential because we've been looking in the wrong places. James watched from the side of the room, technically present as director of outreach but preferring to observe rather than perform. His role had expanded beyond recruitment into something more systemic. He consulted with music schools nationwide, helped redesign application processes, trained admissions officers to recognize excellence that didn't fit traditional templates. The work was exhausting and essential, the kind that wouldn't show results for years but would compound across generations. Patricia Chen presented the expansion plan: satellite programs in 20 cities, partnerships with community centers and public libraries, mobile recording studios for auditions that could happen anywhere rather than requiring travel to major urban centers. The goal is to make auditioning as accessible as making music, she explained. If someone's good enough to play in their neighborhood, they are good enough for us to hear them. A student raised her hand. Aisha, second-year violin performance, recruited from a subway platform in Brooklyn where she'd been playing for rent money. What about the students who don't want traditional careers, who want to stay in their communities and teach, or play locally, or just have music as part of their lives without making it their economic identity? The question had been coming. James had heard versions of it dozens of times in the past year, always from students whose relationship to music was shaped by survival rather than aspiration. The conservatory model assumed professional performance as the only valid outcome, treated teaching as backup plan, dismissed community engagement as settling. That's exactly the question we need to redesign around, James said, stepping forward. The Foundation's purpose isn't to create concert soloists. It's to let people develop their musical selves without economic coercion determining the shape that takes. He looked at Aisha. If you want to teach in Brooklyn, work with kids who look like you did at their age, prove that music exists outside Carnegie Hall. That's exactly as valuable as any other path. More valuable, maybe, because it multiplies rather than centralizes. Richard nodded. We're adding a community engagement track to the program. Full support for students who want to build music education infrastructure in underserved areas. Same resources, same prestige, different outcome measurement. The room erupted with questions, suggestions, personal stories of how traditional paths had felt alienating or impossible. The meeting transformed from report out to workshop, students and administrators collaborating in real time to build something neither group could have imagined separately. Later, James stood at the window watching evenings settle over the city. Streetlights flickered on in patterns that looked almost musical. Somewhere 17 floors down, someone was probably playing for change right now, invisible to everyone except the few who stopped to listen. Richard joined him. Do you ever miss it? The corner. James considered. I miss the clarity. You play, people give you money or they don't, you know immediately if you've connected. He gestured to the room full of ongoing debates and planning. This takes years to know if it worked. But you don't regret it. No. James turned from the window. My mother used to say music was the only thing that couldn't be taken away. That even if we lost everything else, we'd still have that." He smiled, edges bitter and sweet. Turns out she was wrong. It can be taken. By poverty, by circumstance, by systems that decide some people don't deserve access to their own potential. But it can also be given back. That's what we're doing. Returning what was taken. Your mother would be proud. She'd be angry it took so long. Jamesy's voice caught. She'd want to know why the system had to break me before anyone decided to fix it. Richard's expression tightened with the particular pain of someone living with consequences of their own actions. "I can't change what I did. Can't take back that bet or the cruelty behind it. But I can make sure it doesn't happen again. To anyone." They stood in silence, two men whose lives had collided at exactly the right moment for both to transform, whose antagonism had calcified into something like brotherhood through shared purpose and mutual accountability. The documentary's impact continued to ripple outward. Music programs in 40 states had adopted modified versions of the Thornton model. The Federal Department of Education had commissioned a study on access barriers in arts education, citing James's story as case study in systemic exclusion. 3 universities had named scholarship funds after Dmitry Volkov and Thomas Thornton, honoring the connection that had made everything else possible. But the changes that mattered most happened in individual moments, unreported and invisible except to the people they affected. A teacher in rural Kentucky saw the documentary, recognized her own students in James's story, started a weekend program offering free instruction and instrument access. A retired musician in Philadelphia converted her garage into a practice space, opened it to neighborhood kids who had nowhere else to play. A church in Atlanta restructured its music program to prioritize access over ability, created a pipeline from gospel choir to conservatory admission. James received hundreds of emails monthly from people the system had discarded, asking how to try again. He answered every single one, individually, with specific guidance and genuine encouragement. It took hours he didn't have, energy he couldn't spare, but refusing felt like betraying everyone who'd helped him when he was invisible. A year into his role at the foundation, James proposed a controversial initiative, guaranteed basic income for every student in the program. Not scholarships that covered education costs, but direct monthly payments large enough to eliminate the choice between music and survival. The board resisted. Too expensive, too easily misused, too far beyond traditional philanthropy's scope. James pushed back with data from pilot programs, with testimonials from students who dropped out not because they lacked talent but because they needed to send money home, with the cold arithmetic of how much potential the world lost when people couldn't afford to develop it. "We're not funding lifestyles," he argued. "We're removing the economic coercion that forces talented people to abandon music for minimum wage work that's equally unstable but generates immediate cash. If we believe music has value, we have to value the people who make it enough to let them survive while they are learning." The board split evenly. Richard cast the deciding vote in favor. "My father would have done it," he said simply. And honestly, James is right. We keep talking about removing barriers while maintaining the biggest barrier, the reality that you can't eat prestige or pay rent with exposure. The Basic Income Program launched as a pilot with 50 students. Within 6 months, retention rates approached 100%, performance quality measurably improved, and mental health indicators showed dramatic positive shifts. Students who'd been perpetually stressed about survival redirected that energy into practice, study, creative risk-taking. The results were so clear that the board voted unanimously to expand the program to all recipients. Other foundations began adopting the model. Conversations shifted nationwide from how do we find deserving candidates to how do we remove barriers for everyone who's talented. The transformation wasn't complete. Systemic change never is, but the trajectory had bent toward justice in ways that felt permanent. James returned to Berkeley for his final semester. 6 years after he'd first enrolled, for years after his mother's death had forced him out, he was finally completing the degree she'd sacrificed everything to make possible. His final recital approached, a full concert, open to the public, required for graduation. He chose the Hammerklavier, all 4 movements, the piece that had changed everything, that had forced Richard to see him, that had revealed the connection between their families, that had become symbol and catalyst and proof of concept. Playing it felt like closing a circle, honoring every person whose choices had made this moment possible. The recital hall filled beyond capacity. Current students, faculty, foundation board members, scholarship recipients from across the country, strangers who'd seen the documentary and wanted to witness the conclusion of the story. Richard sat in the front row beside Patricia Chen, beside Professor Erickson, beside the woman who'd cried during that first Boardroom performance. All of them were here because a bet made in cruelty had cracked open something neither party intended. James walked on stage to sustained applause. He sat at the piano, a Steinway, the same model from the Boardroom, but this one marked by decades of student use, scarred and maintained and loved. He placed his hands on the keys, felt the familiar cool, smooth resistance, took the breath that precedes transformation. The first chord struck like lightning. B-flat major, fortissimo, Beethoven's declaration that music could contain everything, rage and grief and joy and hope and human complexity too vast for words. James played with the authority of someone who'd earned the right to interpret suffering, who understood that Beethoven's deafness and his own invisibility were different manifestations of the same truth, that worth exists independent of the world's ability to recognize it. The first movement flowed like water finding paths through stone, technically perfect but not sterile, precise but not cold. He'd practiced this piece thousands of times, in his mother's living room while she slept on the couch, on the street corner while tourists ignored him, in his same hall during the semester before everything fell apart, in his apartment during the rebuilding years when playing felt like prayer. Every repetition had added layers of understanding, had revealed new dimensions in music he'd thought he'd already mastered. The second movement began, the scherzo, lighter in mood but no less demanding, requiring the pianist's hands to dance across the keyboard with controlled abandon. James played it with joy audible in every phrase, celebrating not just the notes but the fact that he was alive, able to make this sound after years when silence felt more likely. The third movement approached, the Adagio, 20 minutes of sustained meditation, Beethoven's response to grief and loss and the terrible knowledge that beauty exists even in the worst circumstances. James played it thinking of his mother, of her hands massaging his cramping fingers, of her voice reading library books about music theory she barely understood so she could teach him. He played thinking of his grandfather fleeing his homeland, of Thomas Thornton risking everything to help a stranger, of Richard's father spending decades trying to repay a debt that could never be calculated in dollars. Taste tracked down his face. He didn't try to hide them. Let the audience see that music cost something, that making beauty required breaking yourself open, that transcendence wasn't escape but absolute presence in the moment of pain. The final movement began. The fugue, Beethoven's answer to every question the sonata had raised, complex and rigorous and ultimately affirmative. James played it with the understanding that only emerges through survival, that only comes from standing at the edge and choosing to step back, from being invisible and deciding visibility mattered enough to fight for. The last notes rang out. He held the sustained pedal until silence reclaimed the space. Then he stood, turned to face the audience, and saw every person on their feet, hands raw from applause, faces reflecting the same emotional overwhelm he felt vibrating through his chest. Richard was crying openly. Patricia Chen held his hand, her own face wet with tears. Professor Erickson nodded slowly, the gesture of a teacher watching a student exceed every expectation. The scholarship recipients in the back rows looked like they'd witnessed proof that their own impossible dreams might be achievable after all. James bowed, once, deeply, honoring them as much as they were honoring him. When he straightened, he spoke. Not planned, not prepared, just truth. Music is the thing we make when we have nothing else. When we're cold or scared or invisible or so far from the lives we were promised that hope feels like a cruel joke. We make it because we have to, because it's the only language sufficient for what we carry. But making it alone, in the dark, for audiences that never form, that's not sustainable. That's slow death disguised as persistence. He paused, found Richard's eyes. Someone saw me. Not because I was special, but because he'd been taught to look. His father built a bridge across borders in decades, and I stumbled onto it at exactly the moment I would have fallen otherwise. He gestured to the scholarship recipients. Now there are 300 bridges where there was one. Next year, there will be 1,000. Not because I'm exceptional, but because seeing people isn't exceptional. It's just the thing we're supposed to do for each other. Always. The applause became something more than appreciation. It became acknowledgement, agreement, commitment. These people would leave this hall and find their own invisible musicians, their own talented people standing on wrong corners at wrong times, their own chances to build bridges instead of walls. After the recital, after the reception and congratulations and photographs, James walked across campus alone. The Berkeley Hills rolled toward the bay, lights scattered like stars fallen to earth. Somewhere in the cemetery 90 minutes away, his mother rested under a simple stone he'd finally been able to afford to engrave properly. Maria Volkov Riley. 1962 to 2021. She gave everything so he could have music. He pulled out his phone, opened the voice memo app. Hi, Mom. I graduated. Finally. Played the hammerklavier like grandfather wanted. Like you made me promise. His voice broke. I'm sorry it took so long. Sorry you're not here to see it. But I need you to know, it wasn't wasted. What you gave up, what you sacrificed, it didn't disappear. It multiplied. There are hundreds of kids getting chances now because you gave me mine. Your choice to save grandfather's music, to teach me even when we had nothing, to leave Berkeley so I could try to save you. It mattered. It's still mattering. It's going to matter for generations. He ended the recording, saved it, knew he'd never listen to it but needed to speak the words anyway. Grief was like that. It required expression even without audience, needed to exist in language even when silence would be easier. His phone buzzed. Text from Richard. Dinner tomorrow? Want to discuss expansion to international programs. Your grandfather would have thoughts on helping musicians escape authoritarian regimes. Could use your input. James smiled. The work continued. Would always continue. There was no end point where everyone had access, where systems were perfectly just, where talent and opportunity aligned for every person. But there were moments, individual, specific, unrepeatable, where one person saw another and chose to build a bridge instead of a wall. That was enough. Had to be enough. Was the only thing any of them could control. He texted back, tomorrow works. And yeah, grandfather would have thoughts. Probably most of them about how we're not moving fast enough. Richard's response came immediately. He'd be right. James pocketed his phone, looked one last time at the city spreading below, at the lights representing individual lives and private struggles and invisible victories happening right now in every direction. Somewhere down there, someone was playing music no one heard. Tomorrow, because of choices made today, maybe one more person would stop and listen. That was the measurement that mattered. Not the applause or the degree or the foundation's assets under management. Just one more person choosing to see instead of dismissing, to build instead of excluding, to recognize that worth existed independent of circumstance and that systems served people, not the reverse. James turned from the view and headed home. Tomorrow he'd start at the foundation officially, full-time, no longer a student but a builder of systems he wished had existed when he needed them. The work would be frustrating and slow and would never feel complete. But it would multiply. That was the thing about bridges. Once you built one, other people learned the architecture, started building their own, created networks of connection where there'd been only gaps. His mother had built a bridge from poverty to possibility, through sheer will and sacrifice. His grandfather had built one from repression to freedom through courage and hope. Thomas Thornton had built one from stranger to family through generosity that echoed across decades. Richard had rebuilt the one his cruelty had destroyed, had learned to see people instead of using them. Now it was James's turn, not to repay the debt. That was impossible, had always been impossible, but to pass it forward, multiplied and transformed, until the idea of invisible talent became obsolete, until every person making beauty in dark places knew that someone, somewhere was looking for them. until the music that saved him could save everyone. If you've watched this entire journey, from boardroom humiliation to graduation triumph, from invisible to invaluable, take one final action. Like this video to tell the algorithm it matters. Comment with what resonated, what challenged you, who this reminds you of in your own life. Share it with someone who needs to hear that circumstances don't determine worth, that systems can change, that bridges exist if we choose to build them. Subscribe for more stories about transformation, about justice, about the moments that split one world from another. And check the description box below for similar stories about the people we don't see, the talent we dismiss, the bridges we fail to build until someone forces us to recognize what we're missing.